This is hell.
More and more people are realizing that their work is meaningless and the number of BS jobs is growing every day. Here to tell us why this is a very serious social problem that desperately needs to be addressed before we all lose our sense of self, anthropologist David Graeber is author of BS Jobs, A Theory. Welcome back to This Is Hell, David.
Thank you very much.
It's always great to have you on the show. It's great to hear your voice. And don't forget that we have to keep saying BS because we are regulated by...
We're a radio station. And there are somewhat arbitrary rules, yes.
Exactly.
Just suffice it to say that the title is not actually BS Jobs, but you'll have to guess what it actually is.
Yes, and we're having technical issues with our censoring device, so so let's see which one of us.
Be very, very careful.
I do too. So you write how the polling agency YouGov took it upon itself to test the hypothesis that people believe that they have BS jobs, meaningless work. Conducted a poll of Britons using language taken directly from your original essay. For example, does your job make a meaningful contribution to the world? Astonishingly, more than a third, 37%, said they believed that it did not, whereas 50% said it did, and 13% were uncertain. A later poll in Holland came up with very similar results. So
it was even worse.
So only half of respondents believe their work made a meaningful contribution to the world, because it's 37% said they didn't, 13% said they weren't sure. To you, is meaningless work what's wrong with capitalism in general, or is it what's wrong with the way we are employing capitalism today? Is this a function of capitalism or a function of what we have done to capitalism?
I'm not even sure you can call it capitalism anymore. I mean, one of the few things you could definitely say was a positive element of capitalism is that it tended to actually make stuff and produce a consumer plethora, and get it to people who actually could afford to buy it. That was supposed to be its strong point. The plague of bullshit. Sorry, God, I did it. The plague of BS jobs. The plague of these jobs that are pointless jobs. Yes, is that they are. It's a relatively recent thing. I mean, it's more of the sort of thing you associate with feudalism, where you pay retainers to sit around making you look good, than it is with capitalism. In fact, it was exactly the sort of thing that capitalism was supposed to avoid. Back when there was a competitor to capitalism, back when you had state socialism, they were the guys who made up the meaningless employment. If you go buy buy a magazine in a store in the Soviet Union, there's one guy to take the magazine and another guy to give you a coupon for it, another guy to redeem the coupon. They're just constantly making up unnecessary jobs because they had a full employment policy, and you couldn't get fired once you did get hired. So needless to say, you end up a situation where they used to say, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. So the jobs are largely meaningless. But those were sort of meaningless working class jobs. Now suddenly capitalism, as soon as the Soviet Union collapses, starts creating these sort of meaningless white collar executive jobs. I mean, there's also meaningless blue collar jobs, but most of them are pretty nice office jobs. Often you're a manager, middle manager, you're an executive even. You get paid pretty well, but you're not actually doing anything. It's really strange that capitalism produced this.
Yeah, it is. And you have all these interviews with people who understand that they have meaningless jobs, who have both meaningless work, BS jobs. I've often had conversations with people who tell me, you won't believe how much I get paid for how little work I do. But at other times, those same people will tell me how horrible work has been for them, even working at times 6 and 7 days a week. While I realize this is anecdotal, limited by my own experiences, and therefore it can be misleading, when you talk to people who had BS jobs, were they aware they were BS? And like those I talked to, alternatively working their asses off at their BS jobs, how much do you think the BS nature of their job is masked by how hard the work can actually be?
Well, this is an interesting thing because, there's two ways to have a BS job. There's some jobs where you just literally don't do anything. Or, you're a receptionist at a place that doesn't really need a receptionist, and maybe you get 1 or 2 calls a day, and otherwise you have to sit there and sort of look like you're shuffling papers or doing something. Or, you're running a database that no one ever accesses, and every now and then, once a week, someone will call. There are jobs like that. And then there's jobs where you might be working very hard, but the entire enterprise is pointless. And a lot of people felt that way. I should emphasize here, the key element here is I'm not going to tell anybody who thinks their job is useful or important that they're wrong. That would be obnoxious. What I'm doing is I'm saying, if you think your job is meaningless, well, I'm not going to argue with you either. I mean, who would know better? And a lot of people seem to feel that their entire enterprise shouldn't exist.
You argue that a mafia hitman is not a BS job, and neither is a
Yeah.
hairdresser. But one has a horribly negative impact on society, and the other is a mafia hitman. No, I'm just kidding. Hitmen have a negative impact on society, and hairdressing seems to be a frivolous pursuit. So why doesn't violence or frivolity of work make the work meaningless or the job BS?
Okay. First of all, it really depends, again, on the assessment of the person in it. What I found was that service workers, in the classic sense of the term, people who cut hair, people who serve coffee, that sort of thing, those people generally do not think that they're in BS jobs. They might hate their jobs, often they do, but they don't see it as useless or pointless. That you don't get people saying, I market selfie sticks. Selfie sticks are stupid. It's a job. It's a stupid job. I mean, people kind of accept, all right, if there's a demand for this, who am I to say what people should like? So, on the other hand, there's whole enterprises where, clearly people feel if these didn't exist, the world would be a better place. I think most corporate lawyers secretly feel that way. If there were no corporate lawyers, that would be great. So there's that distinction. The other thing, the mafia hitman isn't a bullshit. God, I keep doing that. The mafia hitman isn't a BS job because he isn't pretending to be anything other than what he is. So there's no BS element, right? He doesn't claim that he's beneficial to society, or maybe he does. Nobody really takes it seriously. And he might have a job where the mafia boss hires him as a security guy in his casino, as cover. Well, that might be a BS job because he isn't really doing it. He's pretending to be something else. But, if he's just going around saying, I'm hired muscle, watch out, well, he's not socially beneficial, but there's no BS element because he's not pretending to be anything other than what he is.
You also define the list of BS jobs falling into 5 categories, and one of the categories is goons. Goons are people whose jobs have an aggressive element, but crucially, who exist only because other people employ them, and you use National Armed Forces as an example. How are the troops a BS job, but mafia hitmen are not?
Well, the troops aren't necessarily. I was just giving them as an example. An example of people who don't only exist because other people do. They don't feel they're in a BS job. Again, I'm not going to argue with them. But, some might. But I think most don't. And also you have to bear in mind armies do a lot of things other than simply protect against other armies. And people in armies are aware of that. But, so I wasn't actually saying that. What I was trying to do is, in that section where I categorize people, is take the 250-odd testimonies I had received, because that's what I did. I went off and solicited and said, all right, have you ever had a really pointless job? I did this on Twitter, so obviously there's a slight bias, right? Since the 68,000 roughly people who follow me on Twitter are probably skewed in all sorts of different ways. But nonetheless, you have to get a sample somehow. And so I said, well, if you ever had a pointless job, tell me all about it. Give me all the details. What was it like? Did people know? Did your boss know? And I got a whole bunch of testimonies. And what I was doing in that section was sorting through the various types and how people themselves explained how that job came about and why they felt it was BS. So a lot of people wrote in and said things like, I'm a telemarketer. This is complete nonsense. There shouldn't be telemarketers. I'm just annoying people or trying to rip them off. I hate it. It's terrible. So, if you're cutting people's hair or you're providing coffee, well, whether or not you think it's good coffee or whether you think they have idiotic hairstyle, it doesn't matter because if you feel you're providing something. But someone like a telemarketer didn't. They really felt bad. They were being forced to scam people who they didn't really want to scam. And I don't know if there's anybody I talked to as a telemarketer who didn't feel their job shouldn't exist. So why do telemarketers exist? I mean, largely just because it's profitable for people. They're a scam. But insofar as there anything else, And I talk to people in businesses. I said, well, you employ telemarketers because other people have them. You don't need them unless someone else has them. I realize the same is true of corporate lawyers. They're a little like feudal lords. Maybe I should have used that as an example instead of armies, because it's a little more accurate. Feudal lords essentially protect you. That was the whole medieval setup, right? There's three categories of people. There's peasants who make food and crafts and provide the necessary means of life. There's priests who pray for your soul, for everybody, and then there's lords who protect you. Well, who are lords protecting you from? Other lords, right? So if there were no lords, you wouldn't need lords to protect you. So it's a little bit like that. Corporate lawyers are the equivalent. They have an aggressive function, but you don't need them unless other people have them. A lot of PR and advertising is like that, and a lot of people who are in PR and advertising did write to me and say that their jobs were pointless and shouldn't exist. So I had to have a category to conclude that.
So one of the things that I was really fascinated about is how BS jobs, meaningless work, can actually create meaningful work. How much meaningful work that is completely unrelated to the actual business of the BS job provider are actually created by BS job? Isn't, for instance, a corporate psychologist helping workers with on-the-job stress, isn't that doing meaningful work?
Yes, well, that's an interesting question. George Luttwak likes to use the examples of all-night pizza delivery men and dog washers. Said these are two jobs that only exist because people are working too hard. So it's work that's created because people were working too hard. Is that necessary or not? I mean, in a way, it feeds off itself a little bit like the corporate lawyers. So you could say that. No, and you could say that, for example, I think Pierre Bourdieu used to do these calculations that, when they introduce workplace efficiency by speeding things up and making things more flexible and basically oppressing the workers a lot, the result is there's more on-the-job accidents, there's more, domestic violence, drunken and broken home, people, can't take it and have nervous breakdowns. So the actual social cost of these speed ups is huge because the government has to provide someone to take care of you when you get drunk and fall off, get hit by a car because you've been overworked and abused. But it's never counted as part of the costs of the efficiency. The speed up is justified by the fact that it saves society all this money, but actually it doesn't. It just takes the cost and turns it over to another part of the state apparatus.
That's fascinating. Is it far more likely that we do not realize we have a BS job if we are doing meaningful work for those who are doing BS jobs? Because I was talking to a contractor, and he was telling me how he does meaningful work. He works with his hands, makes beautiful work, but he realizes the person they're working for, that person does meaningless work, which makes their own meaningful work seem meaningless. How much can meaningful work contribute to BS jobs and the expansion of meaningless work?
That's a really interesting question. I do mention that. Say it is true that 37%, let's say the guys who are wavering are wrong, and just the 37% who say my job is definitely nonsense are right. Okay. Say they're right. Well, that's 37% of all work doesn't need to be done. But what about the guys who are doing support work for that? What about any office where people are just doing some kind of tax scam or something? Somebody's got to water the plants. Somebody's got to do pest control. Somebody's got to do, security. Somebody's got to clean the toilets. That's real work, but it's real work done in support of BS. So this actually creates a conundrum. I mean, what percent is it? I mean, obviously, if you're in a big office building and you're the cleanup guy, probably some of those offices are doing real work. But if you look at proportions of the work that's actually done in our society, and you eliminate, first of all, the jobs that don't need to exist at all. Second of all, the unnecessary work those jobs create for others, which is another issue. And then finally, the real work, which is done in order to support the guys doing the nonsense. Well, I'm sure you could easily get rid of 50% of the work we do, and there would be no trouble at all.
So you write, one might be tempted to conclude that there is at
Yeah.
least one class of people who generally don't realize their jobs are BS, except, of course, what
Mhm.
CEOs do isn't really BS. For better or for
Yeah.
worse, their actions do make a difference in the world. They're just blind to all the BS they create. But if
Yes.
creating the BS is purposeful, how do CEOs not see the BS they create? And can we blame BS work on CEOs for not realizing the work they create is BS?
Well, obviously, the thing is that's not the only thing, but it's a lot of what they do. And I think the thing in CEOs and other people in executive positions is that they're just least likely to admit what's going on because they have such a personal stake in it. And one of the major reasons for the multiplication of these forms of pointless employment is the fact that in large corporations, if you have a firm with 5 guys, probably each one of those 5 guys is doing something. It seems reasonable to conclude. But if you have a firm with 5,000 people, well, chances are there are various managers, and each one has a little empire. And they're vying against each other for prestige and also with other executives based on how many subordinates they have, how many people work in your department. Sometimes pay is directly related to that. Um, so they have no incentive to admit that people are useless. They have every incentive to hire more people under any conditions, as long as it doesn't, actively damage the company in some way that people will notice. And they have no incentive to fire anybody. Now, interestingly enough, they are not considered to be a greater manager if they have a lot of blue collar workers working under them. That's all filed separately somehow. So they're celebrated for cutting the numbers of workers in that sense. If you're a finance guy and finance is kind of fused with the upper echelons of corporate bureaucracy now, you might get praised for like reducing the number of delivery guys. So by speeding it up and making their lives miserable and taylorizing it and doing all sorts of terrible things. But you won't be treated that way for the white collar workers. Instead, it's exactly the opposite. And I've had guys who are efficiency experts, who were hired to sort of see who could get fired, how they could trim the fat in corporations. And they say, I realized I had a BS job because they're just hiring me as a box ticker. They never do this. In fact, one guy said he's been doing this for a bank for 15 years, and the banks, 2 banks, and over that time, neither bank had ever actually enacted a single one of the suggestions. Because every time he says, well, this person is unnecessary, this department is unnecessary, this can be computerized, they say, wait a minute, but that would mean I'd lose half my staff. It'd be half as important a person.
So what explains that if these are BS jobs, why do they continue and persist? Why hasn't market efficiency, David, eliminated
right.
all these BS jobs?
Well, that's the interesting question. And this is what you get from libertarians all the time, right? And sometimes Marxists, too, because they say, oh, it must be creating surplus value for capitalism or else it wouldn't happen, And it's all this, like, my theory says this, so what you're saying can't be happening. You get that a lot. But it is happening. Anybody who works in a corporation, immediately, who isn't the CEO, will immediately say, oh, my God, yeah, it's so true. So it's a kind of a paradox. One explanation is that the market doesn't have much to do with it, or those elements the market does have to do with don't have much to do with hiring and employment within a large corporation or within any sort of bureaucratic operation. Another one is that what we have is increasingly not resembling our classic models of capitalism, and is perhaps not capitalism at all. I coined the phrase managerial feudalism to describe this. Managerial feudalism is basically about redistribution of resources. The first example I found of this, which I thought was very telling, was someone who was working for a big accountancy firm. And they had a huge pot of money that they were supposed to redistribute because of some banking mistake, PPI. It's well known here in the UK, but I don't think people know about it in America. Essentially, they made some kind of accounting error, and people were ripped off, and now they have to give back the money. So there's this huge pot of billions that they're supposed to redistribute to anyone who had a bank account during certain years. Now, what this guy described was intentional mistraining. They would hire people to redistribute the money, then they intentionally train them wrong, or they create systems that work wrong, or they put offices in the wrong city, or they create rules which made you destroy the necessary documents 5 times and then try to make them up again. And they were clearly trying to be as inefficient as possible. But it doesn't seem to make sense until you realize that essentially these guys are paid by the hour. The quicker they distribute the money, the less of that money they get. There's a huge pot, and the more wheels and gears and tunnels and chutes they make the money go through before it gets to the people who are supposed to get it, the more they keep. And in a way, that's just it's a sort of a metaphor, synecdoche, I guess, for what's going on in the entire economy. Less and less profit is coming from making and selling things. More and more profit is coming from redistributing stuff. And if you think about it, it also makes sense because it's a necessary result of trickle-down economics. I suddenly had this sort of epiphany the other day. It's a very simple way to think about it. The one thing left and right all agree on is more jobs is always good, which is a part of the reason nobody does anything about this. No one ever says useful jobs. They just say jobs. And they assume jobs are necessarily useful. Okay, so however, the left-wing solution is, generally speaking, to give money to either poor people or middle-class people who will then go and consume things, consumers. So you give money to consumers. Well, if they're poor, they'll buy food. If they're middle class, they might buy a swimming pool. But either way, you're employing people to make the food or build a swimming pool. So if you give money to poor people, then it creates a certain type of job. Manufacturers, merchants have to hire people to make and sell the swimming pools and food. If, however, you go to the right-wing solution, which is just say rich people are job creators, it's up to them to decide, what to make and who to sell it to. So let's just give money to rich people. Well, then there's no demand for swimming pools or food. So what are they going to do? And this happened recently with the latest tax cuts. They asked a whole bunch of people, CEOs, are you going to hire more people just because you got a tax cut? I believe they were manufacturing companies. And of course, they all said no, because who's going to buy this stuff, right? On the other hand, if you give, what they will do is hire flunkies. So if you give rich people lots and lots of money, well, I guess I'll buy another yacht maybe, but that's pretty limited employment comes from that. So a lot of the money will just get channeled down. All has to do with this redistribution of resources. So they'll just put it, they say, well, I'm supposed to be job creators, I'll hire someone. I'll just hire a bunch of flunkies to make me look good. And essentially that's what's going on.
We are speaking with anthropologist David Graeber, author of BS Jobs, A Theory. David was on our show back in 2015 to discuss his book, The Utopia of Rules. He was also on back in 2013 when we spoke with him about the original essay that was the inspiration for his new book. That article was entitled On the Phenomenon of BS Jobs. And you can follow David on Twitter at David Graeber, Graeber. Do we not consider the potential meaninglessness of our work and the importance of meaningless work in our economy and its impact on our culture for one of the same reasons many do not criticize capitalism or neoliberalism or those who call themselves patriots not blaming their nation, and that is they have a feeling or sense of indebtedness to the system for providing what it does. And has the privatization of the public sphere, the privatization of many public sector jobs, do you think that has switched allegiances from the public sphere, from the government, from the nation to the private sector?
Well, I don't know if people really feel allegiance to the private sector, but they do feel that it should be more efficient. It's very interesting. If you point out to people that most experiences of bureaucracy you have are with private bureaucracies, like your bank or Apple Computer, or your wireless guys. And what they'll say is, oh, but that's not bureaucracy, that's just poor service. So there's a kind of conception that they shouldn't be like that. I mean, they always are, but they shouldn't be. Whereas the government, you really don't expect anything else. So there has been a shift in consciousness to that degree. And there has been a lot of people who will necessarily say, oh, all of these BS jobs are really, first they'll think that you're talking about government bureaucrats. But, they certainly exist in government bureaucracies, but less and less because government gets a lot of attention this way. So there has been a certain degree of political pressure to reduce unnecessary jobs in government. There has been no political pressure whatsoever, quite the opposite, really, about creating unnecessary jobs in the private sector. So to that degree, you could say there's a differential there.
You write that the original essay was just one of a series of arguments I was developing at the time about the neoliberal free market ideology that had dominated the world since the days of Thatcher and Reagan was really the opposite of what it claimed to be. It was really a political project dressed up as an
Mm.
economic one. How much can we say the same thing about BS jobs? Is meaningless work a political project dressed up as an economic one? Are BS jobs not about the market, but control and power over people?
Well, the first person to actually make that argument was George Orwell. He said it very explicitly. Because I said yes in the original essay, and a lot of people, of course, instantly accused me of being a paranoid conspiracy theory guy. But Orwell said it a lot more strongly than I did back in 1943. He said, a lot of useless employment is just the fear of the mob. People think these guys are such dangerous brutes that we just need to keep them off the streets. Better they be doing nothing at all, or work that produces nothing at all than just left to their own devices. And I think there is that. I think you can document fairly clearly that there is a fear of technological unemployment. Keynes coined that term in the 30s. And to some degree, it's like in our system, if people aren't working, then they will starve or be unhappy or be miserable. But to some degree, it's like, well, we don't want these people to have free time on their hands. People will say it quite explicitly sometimes. The example I always like to give is in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a kind of a collective freakout on the part of the ruling class about, they were upset by the counterculture and sort of 60s rebellion, but they started thinking about the space race, the sort of technological change. And there were a lot of seminars on this. I know people who were involved in think tanks at the time. Said that what everybody was discussing is, what are we going to do with the proletariat when the robots replace all the people? And it's a little bit like the discourse now. And some of this later came to surface in things like Alvin Toffler's book Future Shock, where they basically directly say that a lot of these disruptions they thought was due to too rapid technological change. And the basic line seemed to be like, we think this is bad. Oh my God. Within 20 years, the entire working class is going to turn into hippies. What are we going to do?
Yeah, that's really shocking to me. So, is yours not a conspiracy theory then? Because those who are doing it are not conspiring to increase their power and control politically. They're simply all trying to flex the same power for the same results. Is meaningless work not a conspiracy because this is merely the business of the wealthy attaining more and more power?
Well, I mean, to some degree, conspiracy does imply it's secret, and they're not very secret about it. That's a point I always make is that these guys regularly do meet together. They go to Davos and they have little seminars. It's public. You can see what they say. You can go to the G8 where all these leaders and industrialists sit together and say, what are we going to do to the world economy? I mean, this is the kind of stuff that, if they didn't say they were doing it and you said they were doing it, you'd be a crazy conspiracy theorist. But they're totally open about it.
How much
and
are...
if you look at
I was just going to say, because I was just following up on something you were saying, how much are meaningless jobs a creation then of the automation of the economy? As the economy as manufacturing becomes more and more automated, are we going to see more and more meaningless jobs?
Well, unless somebody makes a social issue and does something about it. I think we have two ways here. Back in the 30s when Keynes was saying, technological unemployment is a crisis, and someone documented how every 5 or 10 years, somebody says, oh my God, we're having a crisis. The machines are going to replace the people. We're going to have mass unemployment. What are we going to do? So the whole rise of the robot discourse nowadays is not new. So some people will say, well, look, it's obviously nonsense. Economies adjust. They make up new needs. We could be working 15-hour weeks, but we chose not to, so forth and so on. But actually, you could make the argument that technological unemployment did occur. Actually, from the perspective of Keynes, all these guys are unemployed. They just shove them in these jobs where they pretend to work because we just have this combination of a need to keep them off the streets politically. And this is very important because I said it's not just a political thing, it's a moral and political thing. We have this felt idea that people should be working. And it's true that that idea is very convenient to those in power, but it's not simply an effective power. There's a long theological, social history, which lies behind how we came to the point where we could feel that somebody, first of all, that doing nothing is so bad that it's better to sit there and dig a hole and fill it in again all day than to sit around and do nothing at all. But first of all, that, and second of all, the fact that if you're not just digging a hole and filling it in all day, but doing something that's actually useful, you're less virtuous in a way because you're getting some kind of gratification out of it.
So, because you write about pretending to work to appease a jealous boss, there may not even be an actual boss breathing down one's neck. In fact, usually there isn't. But ultimately, the need to play a game of make-believe, not of one's own making, a game that exists only as a form of power imposed on you, is inherently demoralizing. It's no wonder the soul cries out. It is a direct assault on everything that makes us human. How is doing meaningless work an assault on everything that makes us human?
Well, this is very interesting because it has to do with one's sense of self. And a long time ago, I'd heard this expression that just kind of resonated with me. Sometimes you just hear these things and you say, oh, that's really interesting. I need to look into that someday. Someday I'm going to do something with that. At least I do that. And I'd heard this phrase, the pleasure at being a cause. Because so many philosophers and so many cynical people, just assume that we desire power. Human beings want power over others. We're all in a necessary state of competition. Sometimes they think we just like power, like Nietzsche does, or sometimes they say, well, we want power to guarantee our access to gratification, food, sex, whatever it is we want. But there's an assumption that people wish for power, and actually, an interesting alternative explanation is the one that it's just pleasurable to be the cause of things. It's not like you want to have power over others. You want to know that you caused stuff. You want to know, you say, look, that changed and it was me who did that. And that's really the underlying urge, which then gets perverted into all these forms of power and dominance. And that urge in itself is perfectly innocent and quite a nice thing. And there's a guy named Karl Gross. Not really sure how to pronounce the German word spelled Groos, but Groos. Anyway, he actually did psychological experiments where he discovered that children get their first sense of themselves as autonomous beings, independent of the world around it, when they realize that they can do things that have predictable effects on the outside world. So, like maybe you're an infant, you move your arm and you knock something over. Say, oh, that's interesting. And then you do it again, and the same thing happens. You realize, oh, that's an object, and I'm me, and I can, and if I, manipulate me in the right way, I can have an effect on it. And they just get really happy. This can be documented. They just laugh with just pure pleasure. And this is great. I can knock over a pin as much as I want. And this is like the sort of formative moment when you realize that you're actually a being. You exist. It's not when you stare in the mirror. Lacan is wrong, according to Gross. It's when you realize that you can have effects on the world. And that kind of happy delight, that feeling of this is so cool, I can affect things, sort of underlies your sense of yourself as a person and your sense of being in the world. So what I was suggesting is if you take that away, then, and people have done experiments with that. Okay, kid figures out that he can knock something over predictably and he's really happy. What happens if we change it so it doesn't work, And because they always set up these evil scenarios. And in fact, kids totally freak. They go from being intensely delighted to confusion, rage, and then almost catatonia. They withdraw from the world. So what I'm suggesting is what's happening in a BS job is analogous. And there's also an element of play. This is kind of interesting. Because a lot of play is based on that. Why we enjoy play is our ability to sort of create a world, a make-believe world, is the ultimate extension of that, ability to be a cause and be separate from the world and also affect it and the happiness it brings. But so all these make-believe worlds we create are extensions of that. But this is the opposite. This is a make-believe world you didn't create that's being imposed on you, where you have to pretend that you're doing something, but you're not. So it's a complete inversion of everything he was talking about. So in that sense, if your self and your sense of self and your joy in being a self is based on your ability to predictably have an positive effect on the world as you grow up to care affects others positively as well, then being forced into an imaginary situation where you're pretending to work but actually you're not against your will is the ultimate assault on that sense of self.
You write that asserting oneself creatively or politically against pointless employment might be considered a form of spiritual warfare. What do you mean by spiritual warfare? How could challenging meaningless work and BS jobs be seen as a kind of spiritual violence?
Well, so exactly in that sense. If your sense of self and being in the world is based on that, that is the human spirit in a way. That chuckling child who managed to knock something over and can do it regularly is your soul. This is your sense of what you are in the world. And any attack on that is an attack on the basis of your existence. This is a struggle for spiritual survival in a certain way. At least so could be so imagined. And it's I wanted to put it in these strong terms partly because I want people to feel that they're not crazy, essentially. Because what we're taught is that we're a bunch of people who are essentially all a bunch of lazy scroungers. This is economic theory, just assumes this automatically. Everybody wants to put out the minimum effort to get the maximum reward. So invest the minimum resources and your own efforts are part of those resources to get the maximum out of it, profit. And that's what motivates all human beings to do everything. And it's rational and it's good, and they actually like that. People are like that. People should be like that. And if that were true, of course, if suddenly I get a job where I'm being paid a professional level salary to answer 2 phone calls a day, and otherwise just look busy, I would be delighted, right? I'm getting something for nothing. I have almost no effort whatsoever, and major rewards. So the rational economic actor should be pleased as punch, but the rational economic actor isn't pleased as punch. He's sitting there saying, "Why am I so upset? Why is this driving me crazy?" And it's a real moral confusion results because you feel, hey, I'm being made I'm a parasite, but I don't want to be a parasite. I'm being forced to be a parasite. I'm being forced to pretend I'm not a parasite. Am I allowed to complain? I feel miserable, but I have no justification for feeling miserable. But that makes it even worse. So, in a way, this is why I call it spiritual warfare. You're justified in a different sense of self. You need to assert that, and we need to change people's basic conceptions of what people are and what they're about.
That reminds me of recent conversations we've had with George Monbiot on loneliness, with Johan Hari on depression. How much are meaningless work and BS jobs a result of our economy being a scam? Because you write, many who work in the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, real estate, are convinced that almost everything done in it is basically a scam. How much are BS jobs then simply a result of our entire economy being propped up by a scam?
Well, yeah. When I say it's like feudalism, maybe I'm being gentle and nice. Maybe I'm not putting it as harshly as I could, which is simply that we're ripping people off. And I think a lot of it is. One thing I've been looking into for years, and I haven't really got the statistics, is how much of the sort of average family income is just taken away by people in the FIRE sector. Because it used to be that capitalism meant making stuff and selling stuff, and it was all based on wage labor, right? So you pay people for a product which is more valuable than what you're paying them, and under those circumstances, obviously, it doesn't make sense to hire people who don't do anything. But increasingly, the profits of major corporations are from either finance or from the financial sections of manufacturing companies. So they'll say, oh, the auto industry is actually making a lot of money. But actually, it's often the case that the auto industry itself is making, or the auto manufacturers themselves are making no money from making and selling cars. They're making money from financing the cars. So if it's all usury and, if it's all finance, and finance is a fancy word for other, sort of trading in other people's debts, producing and trading debts. And of course, creating those debts all has to do with the legal system. It's all caught up in the government. And as I've written before, as a result, it's really hard to tell what's public and private anymore. And the government itself is no longer simply guaranteeing property relations which allow you to exploit your workers in the sort of classic Marxist capitalist paradigm, but is rather directly playing a role in taking that money out of your bank account because it's all done through the legal system. Um, well, if you have that kind of thing, to what degree is it just a scam? I mean, you could definitely think of it that way.
Just a couple more questions for you, David. One of the things that you point out is how meaningless work seems to be rewarded and now meaningful work isn't, and that those who are doing meaningless work are often politically motivated or encouraged to not be to be people who are opposed to those who are doing meaningful work. So why do we reward meaningless work and not meaningful work? And is the point of BS jobs by the boss to divide and conquer workers to get those who are doing BS jobs to undermine those who are actually doing it and to disempower those who have meaningful work?
Well, whether they're doing it intentionally or not, it certainly has that effect. And you can't imagine that they don't notice that and that they're not at least a little bit pleased with it, I would say. One of the themes that really came up repeatedly is the weird way in which it's not just that the more your work benefits others, the less you're likely to get paid for it. It's that a lot of people actually seem to feel that's right. I mean, they don't feel it's right for them, right? They don't say, well, my work is useful and it's only right that I should get paid less than that guy who's just sitting in an office doing nothing all day. They don't say that. But in other ways they do, when they're talking about other people's jobs. And I noticed this politically, that right-wing populists managed to get people really angry about teachers. And at first they tried to talk about school administrators, and school administrators actually are causing a lot of the problems in schools. And it didn't take off. No one cared. But then when they said teachers, skyrocketed, like it worked. So they gave up on the administrators. And similarly, auto workers. After the 2008 financial crash, the only people who really had massive economic penalties placed on them, because the bankers still got their bonuses, the executives in the various corporations that got bailed out didn't really have to make any sacrifices. Who had to make sacrifices? The guys who are actually making the cars, which is insane because, how did they, what did they do? But they caused this whole campaign about, look at these guys, or, they're getting $25 an hour, but really they're getting 54 if you count the benefits. And of course, you do that for any, right? And they made this whole campaign, which basically said, these guys get to make cars, and then they want middle-class lifestyles too. These guys get to teach children. There seems to be this idea that if you're doing something which actually benefits society, well, that should be enough. There seems to be this resentment against them. And sometimes it's explicit. People will say, well, we wouldn't want people who are just motivated by money to teach our children, so it's only right that we don't pay teachers too much. And on the other hand, we do want people who are just motivated by money to do our banking, so apparently. So that's okay. So there seems to be this weird resentment of people who do things for any reason other than just the money. Even if it's that knowledge, that sort of warm feeling that you're contributing in some way to a society. Cars are the quintessential American thing, They are providing us with our national soul, by giving us cars we can drive around in, because that's what we are as Americans, They make our life possible, so shouldn't that be reward enough? And the same thing, you saw this in austerity in Europe. In the UK, I mean, notoriously, the Tories would cheer when they voted down bills to raise salaries of nurses and even cops, actually, emergency medical technology. I always use examples people you don't but have an obviously useful job would be the guy who gives you the information in the train station. If he wasn't there, I'd be in trouble, right?
Right.
I'd miss a lot of trains. That's a useful function. And, but those guys all got their salaries cut after the 2008 economic crash. The bankers didn't. So the only possible way you can explain this, you could explain it as power, right? Sure. But why did people keep voting for these guys? Why did people not say that's disgusting and kick him out? Well, part of it seems to be this idea that, well, if you are a teacher, if you are a nurse, you have dedicated your life to helping others. So help out, okay? We're in a national crisis. Somebody needs to cut the money. It should be people who are altruistic. And I call it moral envy, that people have this feeling that, it's not discussed in philosophy. As far as I know, there's no actual term for it, so I had to make it up. It's this feeling of resentment of people who are seen as trying to get recognition for being better than you because they actually are better than you, in the sense of, they hold themselves to a higher moral standard. People say, like, how dare that person want recognition for being harder working and more generous and kind? Even though they don't actually demand it, they just act that way.
This reminds me, the contradiction that I keep getting, David, is I'll have people ask me, well, so you must be making money somehow, and they're trying to find a conflict of interest. Then when I tell them, I don't make any money at this, they get even more paranoid, like they think that I'm up to something else. So I'm damned if I do, and I'm damned if I don't.
You must get something out of it, because rational actors get something out of it, right? So what you're getting out of it is the moral satisfaction. How dare you sit there and think how great you are?
That's why I need to be a rational actor. I've been an irrational actor for far too long in my life, David. One last question for you, David, and as always, our final question for our guests is the question from hell, the question we hate to ask. You might hate to answer. Our audience is going to hate your response. We've been speaking with anthropologist David Graeber. He is author of BS Jobs, A Theory. And in case you're wondering if my question from hell is an anthropologist a BS job, I asked David that back in 2013, so go back and listen to that interview to hear that response. But aside from that, here's my question from hell for you.
Okay.
How much are BS jobs then contributing to inequality, contributing to climate change? How much is meaningless work not only crushing our souls, not only leading to greater and greater desperation for the people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, but how much are BS jobs destroying the planet?
Oh, well, just in terms of inequality, I think inequality can only occur because it's held together politically. And increasingly, what BS jobs have done is created a situation where society is held together by various forms of resentment. That is to say, people in meaningless jobs resent people with actually helpful jobs and try to punish them. Often they try to punish them by creating more and more paperwork and BS for them to do. So they can't do their meaningful jobs. So teachers and nurses, for example, have to spend half their time doing paperwork now. Meanwhile, people in actual meaningful working class type jobs resent the cultural elite because, that tiny, tiny percentage of jobs which are both meaningful and well paid go only to rich people. So they hate those guys. And that's how you get Donald Trump, basically. So inequality is possible partly because our societies are held together by all these hatreds that are ultimately founded on the existence of these kind of jobs. So the other question on global warming, well, the statistic, I don't know the exact numbers, but that really impressed me was that one of the few things that slowed down carbon emissions and might have helped, give us time to save the planet. The most significant thing in recent years that did that was the 2008 economic crash. That after the economic crash, there was a huge slowdown. The Baltic Dry Index collapsed. Ships weren't shipping stuff around. Production fell. A lot of people were unemployed, and there was less carbon, and therefore, the world was a better place. So obviously, the burden fell on the wrong people, but especially as time went on. But think about that. I mean, probably the thing that would most help us as a planet is to work less. And it's very interesting that, this is the one thing that the sort of moralists of our time, I always say that pundits and newspaper op-ed writers are the equivalent of preachers in our modern society. They are the moralists of our day. This is the one thing that they just can't conceive. Anytime there's a crisis, the first thing they all say is, we have to work more. But no, actually, the best way to deal with this crisis is to work much, much less. I will end on that.
Oh, so great. All we have to do is have another great recession. Thanks, David. I really appreciate that happy note that we're ending on. David, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to be bugging you to get you back on soon.
Oh, yeah. Well, do so because I probably say yes.
Okay. I like the probably in there real quick. Thank you, David.
Well, you never know.
Yeah.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Anthropologist David Graeber is author of BS Jobs. David is a professor of anthropology at the London School of Economics. He's been on This Is Hell twice in the past, most recently discussed his 2015 book, The Utopia of Rules, which you can find at our website. David was also on back in 2013 when we spoke about the inspiration for his new book. It was an essay that he had written for a then new magazine called Strike, and the name of that essay was On the Phenomenon of BS Jobs, which you can easily find online. You can follow David on Twitter at David Graeber.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.